Okay, so now we'll just jump in here and continue to refine this. So one thing I did notice with this side of the illustration is I did start to use the shift click method a lot more. You'll notice that when the line's bouncing back and forth through this time lapse, it's me sculpting the line and trying to draw it freehand. And then if it just snaps into place, obviously I'm using shift click. And I started to kind of give into that a little bit more because I noticed it being a lot faster. So, whenever you're doing scenes like this, I think what happens is you start off doing what feels the most comfortable, and then as you get through it, you warm up. You also find things that work a little bit better. Obviously, some of these screens are curved, so I'm going to freehand those lines a lot more. And I'm also going to freehand lines that are a lot shorter by comparison. So, for instance, if it's a straight line and it's very small versus that large screen in front of the main character's face or the guy looking up, then I'm going to use a freehand method for those short lines. It's just quicker, it just feels more natural. And I very much draw from my wrists. So for me, those are easy to do. But if it's a longer, more straight line, then I'm going to use that shift click method. So again, as you start to work through these scenes, you just pick up on what makes more sense and why. And again, you warm up, you start to feel a little more comfortable with your inking process. So always kind of keep that in mind. So when you start a scene, if the very beginning of it isn't feeling right and you're feeling a little bit apprehensive about it, just take solace in the idea that as you warm up, as you get through the scene, the nice work comes out at the end a lot of times. So in the very beginning with a lot of art, it's rough and we're still kind of figuring it out and there's some mistakes there. But as you refine it, as you get warmed up, and as you finish off the work, you can really make it look pretty polished. So just again, allow yourself to make mistakes. I know that's so hard for most artists to wrap their head around, and we're so caught up in the idea of trying to get better and trying to do our best work. But the main thing is that you just keep producing work. You get better through that process. Not that every piece has to be great, that every piece has to be your next best art. So just allow yourself to grow through completing more work. And I very much feel that way with inking a scene like this, that in the beginning I'm like, oh, I don't know if I like this, I better change that. And then by the end of it, I start to feel more comfortable, mainly because you start to realize the direction that you want to take with it, and all the ideas start to flourish through that process. So again, this is real repetitive, just a lot of different line weights. I am trying to make lines that are closer to the camera, a little bit more pronounced and thicker. I will generally go back at the very end and do that even more so if I feel the scene needs it. And remember those small little bits of shadow, even though there's not a lot of shadows in the scene, they help separate those shapes. So just remember that, a shadow behind an object is going to propel the next object, especially with the light source, forward. So if you put a drop shadow or cast shadow, then that next shape is going to push forward. And you just have to be creative in the way that you do that. I probably could have used a lot more shadows in a scene like this and really made those screens sit away from the background. Now notice too there I took the blue line out just to check the work. I really recommend that you do that a lot because as you're implementing all these lines, a big problem that I have is that I won't make them thick enough and dark enough, and then I always go back and do a final touch up. You'll see by the end of the course here how I approach that, but just remember that heavier line weight oftentimes will do you justice, that you just need to go ahead and be bold with your lines and place them in. And if you're someone like me and you can self-identify and go, wow, I always seem to have to, maybe you're on the opposite end of the spectrum, I always have to lighten up my lines, I always have to shift these lines or whatever, then, go into that with the next scene and be aware of that. And like I said, for me, it's like I really have to just start using bolder lines because at the end of every project, I have to always thicken them up. So for whatever reason, I tend to err on the side of lighter lines. And I think it's because I'm trying to incorporate details. So I'm thinking more about details in thinner lines. But for comics, for reproduction, and just for clear visibility of what's going on, you need to think more about shadows and lines a lot of times. Now, it's tough on a scene like this because it's a techie scene. There's a lot of lines. But the shadows are what propel that art forward and give it a solid feel. So you notice that the stuff up front with that silhouette and the screen, that's going to read really well because it's surrounded by some good shapes of shadows, and in turn makes it more pronounced. But I do love details. I do love rendering. You just have to be careful that it doesn't kind of consume the piece and then ultimately makes it harder to read and less effective. Now, another thing is just keep in mind that you're not always going to detail every square inch of a scene. I feel like this one's pretty busy as it is, and I was really going for that, but hopefully I was able to still convey contrast by using different types of rendering. So I've got straight lines and small bits of shadow for the computer screens. I've got shapes of shadows and silhouettes, texture on the planets outside of the windows and on the screen in front of the character. So these different things that hopefully make it read individually and separated from one aspect to another. So one of the things I noticed with some art that could otherwise be really amazing is you'll see people kind of latch on to a specific type of shading, and they use that all throughout everything they do. So every piece, every character, every background has the same kind of cross-hatching. And I would say to really be careful of that. It's not so much that it has to be this perfect idea of cross-hatching or shading, but it's utilizing these different versions of texture and rendering throughout. So I've seen illustrations that the shading isn't so well constructed and kind of messy, but they used it in such a way where it still made this very dynamic, in-depthy scene. So again, it's kind of that idea that we just have this 2D surface, this very flat object that we're trying to make look dimensional, and we have to employ all these different techniques to make that happen. But it's easier if you have more tools in your toolbox and more technique. And it doesn't have to be pretty and pristine. It can just be a nice variety. So practice straight lines, which would be called hatching, cross hatching at different angles, different shapes of shadows and the way that you use those, and stippling, all these different things. Practice a lot of them on just a blank white piece of paper or a digital canvas or sketchbook, and really log in lots of hours just doing that. So then when you go to your scene creation, you have lots of ideas and lots of ways that you can render some surfaces. I think that'll really help. So that'll bring this lesson to a close. We'll jump back into real time now and continue to detail this scene. So with that, let's move forward.